Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends. Before I start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land where we meet today, the Wurundjeri people, and pay my respect to their elders, past and present. My name is Khayri, and I am the Vice President of the Australian Iraqi Forum and the organization's cultural coordinator. I assisted in the preparation and coordination of this seminar today and worked closely with the organizers, Dr. Ben Isa from Deakin University and the Iraqi Australian University Graduates Forum, a Sydney-based organization, and represented today by Mr. Firas Naji, who is the chairperson of the cultural committee of the organization. The seminar today is part of the Iraqi Cultural Festival organized by the Iraqi Australian University Graduates Forum. The festival includes a range of cultural activities that represent the diverse sections of the Iraqi community in Australia. The festival will take place in Sydney on the 19th and the 20th of March. Firas, as the chairperson of the organizing committee, will be happy to talk to you after the seminar about the activities involved in the festival. I would like to specifically welcome our international and interstate guests to our city, the city of Melbourne, the most livable city, definitely ahead of Sydney. This might upset our Sydney guests. We are very fortunate to have tonight 3 internationally recognized academics and researchers who have contributed a great deal to our knowledge and understanding of the political, cultural, and social dynamics in the Middle East and in Iraq specifically. In a very brief statement, Iraq is a human tragedy, and for most Iraqis, it is a heartbreaking story. Over the last few decades, Iraq as a state has dramatically changed. As a nation, the Iraqi society has drastically transformed. The Iraqi people continue to suffer and continue to pay a dear price for the 30 years long dictatorship regime, 2 unjustifiable wars, 10 years long United Nations harsh sanction, and above that, the invasion of 2003 with all its consequences, followed by a failed system of government with the country threatening to split along sectarian and factional lines, and extremist groups gaining a foothold in almost 1/3 of the country's land. Political analysts believe that if the current trend in Iraq continues, Iraq's sovereignty and territorial integrity is in a real danger. Today's seminar will shed some lights on what has happened in Iraq and in the region as a whole in the last few decades, and its impact on the future of Iraq, its people, and the region, and the world indeed. This is my job today. Without further ado, I will hand over to Firas to facilitate the rest of the session. But before I go, a couple of housekeeping issues. Toilets are at the far end of the room. And may I ask you all to switch off your mobile phones or put them on silent. Coffee, tea, and refreshments will be served after the seminar, and I encourage you all to stay for conversation. Thank you again, and enjoy the evening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Khayri Majid. I really appreciate your work, and he's done a great job. Actually, without him, we wouldn't have this seminar here tonight, so thank you again. And I also like to thank my friend, Dr. Kamran Abduka. In Iraq, we used to call him Kamiran. He's my friend, he's my youth friend. We used to go to high school together and university, and he did very well in promoting the event, so thank you, Dr. Kamiran Abduka. I also would like to thank the Council for Australian Arab Relations, who actually sponsor the whole visit of Dr. Andrea, and without the sponsorship, again, we wouldn't have this seminar tonight. I would like first to talk a little bit about the Iraqi Cultural Festival, Khayri, because not to promote the event, and it's a very good event because it has a very diverse program. We've been working very hard on this. It will be over 2 days. Andrea will be there in Sydney as well on Saturday. He will be the keynote speaker, and we have a very rich program of, you name it, dancing, singing, theater, short films, and all of that. But I'm mentioning the Iraqi Cultural Festival because it's relevant to our talk tonight. The Iraqi Cultural Festival, it's a success story. It's a story of the Iraqi community with all its diverse constituents coming together. And they are coming together to showcase their culture, art, and history. But this coming together, this collaboration, this partnership is actually happening at multiple levels. So it's happening at the organizational level. So all the organizing committee, they are representative of these diversity. There are Kurds, Christians with different denominations, Mandayans, Muslims, Arabs, you name it. And also the presentation of the program. When you look at there's musicians, the same composition is there, or it's a play, or it's a choir. And I think this is a testimony, it's a demonstration that despite of what Dr. Khayri was talking about and all the news, which are all true, there is fighting in Iraq. People, the minorities, those same minorities are being depleted from Iraq. Iraq is losing its diversity. But at the same time, what we're seeing here is that in the Iraqi diaspora, people are coming together. So having all this diversity together coming under one banner, Iraq, retaining their sub-identities and keeping to the broader overarching Iraqi identity is happening as well. So this is in contrast with the news and all that we've been talking about. So I think from this end, I would like to introduce the session for tonight. How can this happen? From one end you have these things, from the other end you have people fighting, killing each other, and all the rest of it. So, as Dr. Khayri mentioned, we have a great selection of speakers tonight, and it takes me great pleasure actually to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Andrea Tetti. So I will not take more of your time. I will introduce Dr. Teti, and then he will take you through his presentation. The way it will be that Dr. Teti will do a presentation, and then I'll ask questions to both Lucia and Ben to have their contribution to tonight, and then we will open it for questions and answers. Andrea Teti is a senior lecturer at the University of Aberdeen, where he specializes in Middle Eastern and EU politics. He is co-director of both the Center for Global Security and Governance and senior fellow of the Brussels-based think tank, the European Center for International Affairs. Dr. Teti is currently scientific lead on the European Commission-funded Arab Transitions Consortium, which recently have undertaken large quantitative study of the beliefs, values, and behavior with respect to political and social transformation in 7 Arab countries, including Iraq. And he will talk more about this project and the results from Iraq. And Andrea has published extensively on the Middle East, the Arab uprising, and European governments' responses. So, Andrea Teti.
Thank you very much. First of all, thanks to everyone for organizing this. Thanks for everyone for showing up. I should say that I got off a plane about 4 hours ago after about 45 hours of planes, trains, automobiles delays, and I'm really terrible at sleeping on planes. So if I lose the plot a little bit, I've asked everyone to sort of nudge me back to sanity. So, but thanks for everyone for showing up. I should say what I'll do is I'll make a couple of remarks about some of the most important elements or factors in the last 100 years of Iraqi history that I think have an impact on. I'll mention some of the trends that I think are the most important things to keep in mind in the presentation, in our discussion. And then what I'll do is I'll launch into some of the data that we've got through the project about Iraq. And what I'd be really interested in is, of course this is national level survey data, but it'd be really interesting to get your feedback from the kinds of experiences and direct or indirect through family connections or personal experience that you... Sorry? Can you hear me?
Not understanding well. We need higher sound.
Okay, how about now? Is this better? So, can you hear me at the back? Yeah? Yes. Okay. Right. So, if you can't hear me at the back, raise your hand. Anyway, right. So this is obviously national level data, and if you have any comments or feedback on whether the data looks like it reflects experiences that you have, or that reflects experiences of people who you know, then that would be great. That would be really invaluable input for us. Right, okay, let's just keep going. Yeah? Shall I keep going? Or, yeah? Right, okay. So the main data that I'm going to present is going to do with perceptions of the main challenges that Iraqis, respondents feel that they face, what they think about the political system, whether they trust each other, and issues to do with governance, for example, corruption, what the main ideas, perceptions around democracy are, and factors like migration. You know, if to the extent that this is a questions that we asked around for all 7 countries that we surveyed. You know, what factors lead to migratory pressures? Now, I actually want to skip through this stuff because it's too long. But I just want to say, want to summarize the first 7 slides in just one comment, which is the following. When Iraq was created as a, so to speak, modern nation state, as we know, it grouped 3 what were 3 provinces in the Ottoman Empire under the rubric of a single nation state, or what was supposed to be a single nation state. What that did was it set up a series of tensions, competitions over central state resources, institutions, political influence, economic influence, and so on. So a tension between competition over the center and local authority structures, whether they're provincial or tribal, religious, and so on. So you have this tension between these 2 different levels of Iraqi politics, life, society, that produces, on the one hand, drives towards centralization. So, for example, after oil was discovered, you have this attempt to oil rent-driven centralization, homogenization of Iraq. And on the other hand, you have a very long history that, of course, you know better than I do, of attempts to resist these efforts of centralization, whether it's in the north, Kurds, of course, other minorities as well, or in the south, Shia, and so on. So you have this tension that's set up. As soon as the British impose this form of the nation state, you start having these processes of radicalization between center and, so to speak, periphery. Now, this was actually quite useful for the British, because what they wanted to do with the imposition of this state system, this modern state form, was precisely to divide and rule. Okay, so they thought that it would be more efficient than having direct colonial control to be able to sponsor this or that local faction that would be, in a sense, doing the British dirty work and controlling Iraq. Now, of course, this sets up a toxic dynamic that we see the results of, in a sense, over the last 100 years or so. So I think it's very important to keep in mind that framework when we look at the data. Well, really, when we look at the questions about Iraq's future today, you know, how do we, for example, formulate a plan under which various communities can live in harmony, or under which, you know, there might be a federal Iraq, or that effectively works, or whatever other political arrangements might come in the future. So in that context, I want to talk about some of the main results that we get from the project. If you don't mind, is it okay if I stand up? I think better when I'm on my feet. So, to give you an idea of what the project is, it involves 11 partners. It's funded by the European Commission, as Firas was saying, and it's a 3.5-year project. What we're trying to do is we're trying to yes. Sorry about the slide. It doesn't actually look that way as I have it. But the long and short of it is that what we're trying to do is we're trying to carry out a number of surveys in 7 Arab countries, all of North Africa plus Iraq and Jordan. And those surveys ask 85 questions that generate just short of 300 variables. And what they try to do is they try to analyze key factors, key trends in the political, social, and economic life of all 7 countries that we're looking at. What we then try and do with that survey data is plug it into quantitative data that we have from other sources. So, for example, other sister surveys, other macro indicators, for example, the Bertelsmann Transformation Index, the notorious Freedom House Index, and so on. So we actually have a very large database in which we combine all these different sources of quantitative data. Quantitative data, by the way, of course, is fine, but speaking as someone who does a lot of field work with interviews, we try to balance the quantitative analysis also with qualitative work. What we try to do with all this information is try to understand what the processes have been at play, specifically in the wake of the uprisings of 2010-2011, but more generally in the last 15 to 20 years. What are the key trends, what are the key challenges, not just, of course, for Iraq, but also for the region as a whole. Right, and that's what we're trying to do with this work package, which is work package 7 on transition analysis. Then we have some specific themes that we've been asked to look at by the European Union, such as Euro-Mediterranean relations, but I won't be saying anything about that now. So let's start at the beginning. If we ask respondents, what do you think the main challenges that Iraq is facing? What are those challenges? Well, this is the result that we get. So we have, unsurprisingly enough, if I manage not to kill myself, 60% of people think that internal security is the most important factor. Am I doing this wrong? Right. I'll try to stand away from the speaker. Thanks, Ben. So 60% of people think that internal security is a major challenge. That's not surprising. 50%, just short of 50%, think the economic situation is a major challenge. Right? Again, not particularly surprising. At 32.5%, we have the corruption of politicians. And as an Italian, I'm very sympathetic to that view. Corruption of public servants, just short of that at 31%, so corruption is a very big problem. And at somewhat less than both of, or all four of those first four factors, is authoritarianism, external influence, and perhaps surprisingly, the Palestinian situation at 1.6%. I should say that, by the way, this is a result that we have from all 7 countries that we surveyed. So although, especially regimes make a big deal of the Palestinian question, in practice it seems as though populations are much more interested in what's going wrong at home rather than what might be the situation in Palestine, for better or for worse. If we ask how respondents view the security situation in Iraq, what's their biggest concerns, you can ask that question at various different levels: national level, district, family, neighborhood, and so on. And it seems as though people are much more concerned about the security of the nation as a whole than they are at a local level. So although they feel that their local contexts are actually quite challenging from a security point of view, they seem to be even more concerned about the future of the nation as a whole. And by the way, I have to apologize for there's a series of shades in there that show up on my slides, but for some reason don't show up there. This is another interesting question for us. We asked how much respondents worry about various different kinds of security issues. So yeah, we're worried about security in general, but specifically, what are you worried about? And we've seen that war, terrorist attacks in particular, seem to be the biggest concern. Again, it's not surprising that it's quite interesting that the team that I work with is divided half between quantitative analysis experts, number crunchers, who don't know anything about the specific histories of the Middle Eastern countries that we're looking at, and the rest of us who do know a little bit about these countries. And for the quantitative analysis, people will say, "Oh, this is amazing, this is really interesting. I wonder why they're," for us, if you know a little bit about the country, you know a little bit why. But what I found interesting about this data is that we can then split or decompose the responses by religious affiliation. So we ask respondents what their religious denomination or religious affiliation might be, and you can't really see this again because of the slides or the projector. So what's interesting for me here is that Shiites seem to be much more concerned about security issues than Sunnis, right? Now, there needs to, of course, also be a breakdown by region, but my quantitative analysis team have not yet sent me this data, so we can't talk about that. But we can more or less guess what that would look like. But it's interesting to me here that Shiites seem to be more concerned about things like terrorist attacks, for example, than Sunnis. So Shiites, 89%, Sunnis, 65%, as you can see. And this is one of the useful things of the of quantitative analysis. It can, from the point of view of an area scholarship or area knowledge, you would expect it to maybe be the other way around. So quantitative analysis can help us in these kinds of contexts to ask, to see whether there are questions or issues, trends that we might be missing. Then we asked respondents a bunch of questions about the political system and what they thought about the political system in general. Starting from the first question, which, again, would be a nice pie chart if you could see the colours, but you can't. All the way down to much more detailed questions that we'll come to in a second. So we asked, what do respondents think about the political system in general? It's a very generic question, and it allows a lot of freedom. Because basically you're just asking respondents to say, very good, very bad, somewhere in the middle. And the answer is that most people, again, unsurprisingly for those of us who are interested in the actual countries, most people think that the situation is not very good at all. Interestingly, if you break down this data based on factors like income, for example, you see that people who find it very easy to save, so people essentially who are wealthy, are much more optimistic about the political system than people who find it very hard, right? So optimism is directly correlated with income. Which again, you know, if I'm rich, I'm normally quite optimistic. It's quite. Secondly, we asked a bunch of questions about political mobilization. So if the situation is good, if there are a lot of, or rather, if the situation is bad, we're concerned about security threats, then how would this translate into actual political action or potential for political action? Here we have the data on political mobilization. The long and short of it is that, the interesting data is actually what would have been the graph on the right, where we see we see, that's a euphemism. What we would see, if we could project the colors properly, would be that young people are less interested in politics and less likely to take part in political actions than older people. Now that's interesting because usually it's the other way around, okay? So what this is telling us is one of two things. Either young people are demobilized, you know, they don't participate in politics at all because they don't care, and we can check this with follow-up questions, or they don't feel that the political arena, the political actors in the formal political arena, party politics, leaderships and so on, they don't trust those leaders. So their political interests or their political concerns are channeled in a different way. And that, to be honest, I think is rather what's happening based on some of the other data. The top graph would have shown you the division we split by religious affiliation, the likelihood of participating in political action, okay? Specifically looking at the division between Sunni and Shia. And what the data shows us is that actually, unsurprisingly perhaps, Sunnis are much more likely to engage in virtually every form of political action by comparison to Shias. The only area in which there's a comparable level of political engagement is with attending demonstrations. So if you ask people whether they're interested in joining boycotts or doing something as basic as signing a petition or joining strikes, the Sunnis are much more likely to do this than Shias. I should say, by the way, that the survey was carried out actually between May and June of 2014, so it reflects that particular point in time. And in a way, we were very lucky because the surveys were carried out in places like Mosul literally days before ISIS took over, or Daesh, whatever we want to call it. If we look at another index of political mobilization or political participation, voting, we again see that younger people tend to be a bit less engaged than older people. Okay? So in a sense what the data is telling us is that there's a problem with engagement of younger people, whether it's because they find the leaderships unappealing or whether it's because they're just not interested in politics as a whole. is difficult to tell from this kind of data. But then, of course, you can do qualitative follow-up interviews with youth and so on. If we then move on to government performance, I think this is an area where we start seeing, and I'll mention something about corruption in a second. I think we start seeing some of the important pieces of the puzzle that tell us why it is that we have this, well, of course, split between different identities of Sunni and Shia, why we have young people who are not engaging in conventional politics or find conventional politics disillusioning. Let's have a look at what our respondents think about the government's performance as a whole. We looked at 5 key areas: providing security, basic utilities, controlling prices, so having a control over, some kind of control over inflation, which is of course important in day-to-day life, narrowing the gap between the rich and the poor, and creating employment. Okay? So all of these are kind of basic functions of a modern state. Yeah? And on all of these, well, the area where the government scores the highest is providing basic utilities. But if we look at that number, 43.3% of levels of satisfaction, that's actually very low. So it puts into context, you know, nearly, well over half of the population have no confidence in the government's ability to provide basic services even. And that's the best score that they get. So if you look at the others, controlling prices, for example, that means 75% of people don't have confidence in, don't rate the government's performance in controlling prices. That means a lot of people who are disenfranchised. Right? If we look then in more detail at the services that the governments provide, and what respondents think about those services, we see, if you can look at the first 2 numbers in what would be lighter shaded areas, but the first 2 numbers on the left there give you an idea of people who are either definitely dissatisfied or rather dissatisfied, quite dissatisfied, right, with those services. If you put those 2 numbers together, you get an index of a rough indication of how displeased people are with those services. Social security system, well, what's that, 60-70%, just about 70%. Healthcare system, again, a little short of 65%. Education system, 54, 56, 55%. Local authorities solving regional problems. This says something about local government as well. Again, very dissatisfied, over 60%. Government performing its duties. 73% of people, nearly 3/4 of people are dissatisfied or rather dissatisfied with the government's ability to resolve, to perform its duties. Developing the economy, that's 66, around about 66%, so 2/3 of people are dissatisfied with the government's ability to intervene and develop the economy. That's a hell of a lot of dissatisfied people. I think for us, you know, having knowledge of the area or personal connections to the area, that's fairly obvious. But to see it in one place, I think paints quite a stark picture of the current situation, but also the challenges that the government, any government, might have. Unsurprisingly, you see, well, actually, the top graph would have been breaking down that perception by income. So how rich you are seems to be correlated with how satisfied you are of the government's provision of all those services. And unsurprisingly, the wealthier you are, the more satisfied you seem to be. Conversely, the poorer you are, the more dissatisfied you're going to be. And so, and that's quite important if you're a government trying to stem, for example, the possibility of instability or worse, political radicalization. Those numbers should be very, very worrying. We then broke those numbers down again by Sunni and Shia, and what we've seen here is that Shiite respondents are more concerned than their Sunni counterparts about, or they're in a sense happier with the results than their Sunni counterparts in all areas except providing security, which is quite interesting as a result. So what these data seem to be saying is that Sunni respondents are more satisfied with the government's performance of providing security than the Shia. And that seems like a counterintuitive result, based on the politics of the country. It may be because we need to still disaggregate this data by regional components. So it may simply be that in that Sunni component, there are a lot of Kurdish Sunnis who might be quite satisfied with. Yeah.
Sorry, there's a question about, is it about Sunni or Shia? There is Christians and other people who do.
Yeah, so the question is, do we only split between Sunni and Shia, or does the survey contain questions about other religious affiliations? It does, is the short answer to that. The only reason why I'm presenting the Sunni-Shia split is because it's particularly politicized at a national level. But the data does contain all those, yeah. It's just for presentational purposes, so for which I apologize. I should say, by the way, if you do have questions, please do feel free to raise your hand and interrupt me. Corruption, okay. I'm really curious to see, I need to go and look at some of the data on Italy, but I'd be really curious to see whether people in Italy feel that their government is more corrupt, or whether Iraqis feel that their government is more corrupt. I did research on this a few years ago, in 2010, ironically, and it's very interesting because if you plot there's a thing called the Corruption Perception Index, and basically what it is Transparency International asks a bunch of elites how corrupt they feel their country is. And Italy was dipping below progressively greater numbers of Middle Eastern countries, despite the fact that Italian politicians like to think that they're somehow different from their Mediterranean cousins, which of course they are, because we didn't protest in the same way that you guys did in 2010, 2011. There you go. So the figures for corruption are very significant. Unfortunately, we can see them because they're in red. So to a medium extent or to a large extent, is there corruption in public life in Iraq? And respondents said overwhelmingly, so over 66%, over 2/3 said yes, there's corruption. Which might not be surprising. What is interesting and significant is the follow-up question, which is how many respondents believe that the government's actually doing something about it? Because you could say, okay, there's a lot of corruption, but the government is nonetheless doing something about it. It turns out that only 32%, so less than a third, believe that the government is actually doing anything about corruption. Okay. So again, this is another area where we see respondents telling us effectively that they're extremely dissatisfied with the state of affairs in Iraq. And what that does is it sort of delegitimizes central state power. Yeah, it creates a challenge to its legitimacy. 5 minutes. Okay. Yes. Yeah.
Do you differentiate the question about the government? Is it central government? Is it regional government? Is it local government? Is it what?
That's correct. There are those. The question is about corruption at a national level, so at the federal level. But what we can do is we can, what we do is we look at issues of corruption broken down by region and in fact by province or by governorate. So we can have a more fine-grained view than that.
Having said that, if a question is, for example, in the northern of Iraq, and you ask them, the government simply to them means the regional government, yeah, not the federal government.
No,
even if you use the word federal government or central government, yeah, their understanding this is the government.
Of course, of course. And that's why what we do in the training of the, because I mean that's, sorry, so the point is when you ask respondents a question about the corruption of the government, what do they understand? Do they understand the federal government or do they understand the local government? But the answer is they will understand the federal government because survey teams were instructed specifically to make that differentiation. So if a respondent said, but what do you mean? They would clarify that it's the federal level government that we're talking about. But that's very important, and we do have questions about regional level. So as well as being able to break down the data by regional composition, we also have questions about regional government. So we can try and get at that issue that way. Again, forgive the simplicity, but we've broken down the perception of corruption responses by Sunni-Shia divide, and you can see that actually there's a fairly strong divide between the two. What's interesting is that the Shia seem to be more convinced that there's either a small or a medium amount of corruption, whereas the Sunnis seem to feel much more strongly that there's a lot of corruption. So nearly 3/4 of Sunnis believe that there's a lot of corruption. But having said that, as opposed to only 53% of the Shia. But again, these are very, very high numbers. All of this speaks to the fact that the central government, whatever it is that it's doing, it's not making people happy at all. It might be making certain people even less happy than others, but nobody's happy. Right? And trust, and this is another piece of data that goes in the same kind of direction. The general question that we asked is, do you think that most people are trustworthy? Right? And over 2/3 of people said that they are not. Only 1/4 of people said that that they thought people were trustworthy. And there's a big, so that's already a significant problem. It's indicative of a significant problem. If you then again split it by Sunni and Shia, you see that Sunni only believe that 18.9% of people are trustworthy, and the Shia 33%. And while 33% is again a lot higher than 19%, it's still very, very low. So it's indicative of a society in which trust has been eroded. And then if you look at, we ask specific questions of trust in specific institutions, so courts, parliaments, parties, armed forces, police forces, civil society, religious leaders, and so on. You can see that even the institutions that scored the highest, for example, local government and the army, surprisingly enough, and religious leaders, right, so score in the mid-50s, still that means that 50% of people don't trust them. Okay. So yes, here we go. And again, we have a breakdown of data by Sunni-Shia splits and by income as well. And again, richer people tend to be more optimistic, and Shiite respondents tend to have a more positive view of local institutions across society than their Sunni counterparts. But again, with a few exceptions, for example, there's a very high level of Shiite trust in armed forces and in local government, but with few exceptions, these are very low numbers in any case. Now, I think actually what I'll do is I'll stop there in terms of the presentation of the data. This is also such a thing as hitting you over the head with too much data all in one go. I think the bottom line is that I think actually this is one thing that we could do is I have a bunch of data here, and if there's any particular aspect that you're interested in, I can quickly try and rifle through the data that I have and see if I have answers to those questions. But I think what's important to take out of this is that we have a kind of large-scale quantitative sort of confirmation of a picture of Iraqi society that is facing enormous challenges. Right? And these enormous challenges, we could look at them on the one hand. Firas, you were saying at the beginning about the challenges facing Iraq today, the question of unity, federalism, multiculturalism, coexistence, and so on. And I think the standard way of looking at these challenges is to say, my God, this is a very difficult situation. How is Iraq going to stay together? Should it stay together? Is it possible to find a compromise between various political representatives and so on? The optimistic take on the data that we've been looking at now is that, in a sense, I'm trying to be optimistic, although I study political science, so, you know. I think the optimistic take on this is to say that actually, if we had governments, whether at the local level, regional level, or a national level, that were capable of performing certain basic functions, like delivering basic services and so on, then what that would do is it would address people's needs to such an extent that it might create a context within which sectarian processes become depoliticized, so they become less important. In a sense, why do people appeal to sectarian identities? Why do they throw themselves into identity politics? Because evidently they're not being, the demands, the objectives that they have are not being met by the current political system. So in a sense, although the data is very dire on the cohesiveness of Iraqi society as a whole, the flip side of that is that if we do relatively little, relatively well, then that is likely to have a disproportionately high impact on rebuilding trust, rebuilding cohesiveness, giving people a common ground upon which to start anew. So I'll finish on that note, and please, if you have any questions about specific data, then I'm more than happy to answer them.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. You mentioned at the start of your speech that was for 7 countries, or that was specifically for Iraq, this data?
No, this data is for Iraq. So the question is this about Iraq only or about all 7 countries? This is about Iraq specifically.
Okay, what was the, like, how many people you, that was the sample, how many people and what were they? Like, could you tell us from the province, or they were like, say, university student, or they were what?
Yeah. So the question is about sample design. So how representative is the data? The data, I should have said, is designed to be representative at a national level. So we interviewed more than 1,500 people, and they're taken in such a way as to reflect the demographic profile of Iraq as a whole. So the breakdown of religious, socioeconomic conditions, political identities, and so on. The sample size is taken in such a way as to reflect that. Now that's the short answer. The longer answer is that a lot of this depends on the quality of the demographic data that we have to go with in the first place. And the quality of that demographic data, normally it's census data, right? Now the quality of that demographic data, even at the best of times, is something that we need to be very aware of. For example, in another country, Egypt, if you ask CAPMAS, which is the National Statistics Institute, the official government body for statistics, what the rate of growth of the population has been over the last 70 years, they give you a fixed 3.8%. So somehow, since the 1940s, Egyptians have been having babies at a rate of 3.8% of the population every year. And clearly that's unreliable statistics. In a country like Iraq, for example, there are additional problems that have to do with population movements over the last 13 years, specifically. But those are all things that we try to compensate for in the way that we weight samples. So we're trying to make sure that the people who we interview are representative of the Iraqi population as it is, and that the way that we generalize the data reflects the way, the characteristics of the population at the time of the interviews. So,
did you say 1,500 or 1,500? 1,500.
1,500.
That's a small number for Iraq, is it, as a whole?
No, actually no. The standard size, the minimum statistical size, statistically significant size that you can do these kinds of operations on is 1,000. So actually, the surveys that we carried out are better. They give you a more nuanced picture than standard surveys.
The question comes now, it's your finding, you give it to EU, is it? That was from EU. The survey was to be done on behalf of EU. So when you, that's 2 years past, what do you reckon? What do you think? What EU done with this survey? What the findings? Is there any like good in it, or was just a survey put on the other surveys?
That's a great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's a great question. Actually, since we carried out the surveys, there's a very long process where you have to clean the data, and I won't bore you with the technical details, but it's quite a long process to actually get to the point where we are now. So we have given this data to the EU about 2 months ago. The project completes in September of this year. So all the different parts. The survey is one element, but then there's the longitudinal analysis, which is the 10, 15-year trends that we've been looking at, the larger database of all the other indicators and so on. And I have to say, actually, the European Union seems to be very interested in this. They actually just a couple of weeks ago invited us, as well as a couple of other projects that specifically focus on youth in Arab countries. A project called Sahwa and another one called Power to Youth, to meet with policymakers in Brussels in June. And then in September we're going to meet with policymakers and other stakeholders, so NGOs and so on and so forth, to talk about the results. And what we're trying to, I mean, there are certain areas that the European Union, but other governments and stakeholders generally, so as I was saying, NGOs, civil society groups, charities, are interested in, and they have to do with security, they have to do with the cohesiveness of societies, they have to do with migration, for example. So we didn't really have time to look at the migration data, but again, in the cases of Iraq and Libya that we surveyed, the security situation is the primary driver for people to look to emigrate or consider emigrating. But for all the other countries, it's economic situations. And if you ask people, what is the most effective thing that the European Union or another international body can do in terms of intervention or support for the 7 societies that we looked at, overwhelmingly the response tends to be to act on the development at the economic level. There's an understandable skepticism around democracy promotion, but those are the two main areas. So I think from policymakers' point of view, they're interested in the general trends, what we can tell them about the general trends of processes that have been going on in the Middle East since 2011. And they're also specifically interested in a series of issues like migration, like security, like relations between the EU and its Mediterranean counterparts. So we try the best that we can to tell them that, hey, this stuff is important, it's significant, you should be basing your policies on this.
Sorry, should we provide our notes and question or later? Now is it possible?
I'll leave that to you.
I think if we have specific questions about the survey, maybe it's a chance now for Andrea to respond to it, but if we have general questions, I think we'll leave it till the end after the other presenters will do their presentation. I think that's probably the best way.
Yep, sure.
Okay, so if there's no immediate, yes, please.
I have 2 questions, which is exactly the same as the previous person who spoke. Number 1, about the sample. Now, we say this is a general sample, so it wasn't related to a specific political organization, but you chose randomly from the people everywhere. This is number 1. Number 2, the situation in Iraq now has changed. By liberation of many cities in the western part of Iraq, and that liberation from Daesh changed the political and the idea of the people living in these areas. Now you are going to present these data from 2011, is it? 14. Now, if you do your survey, you are going to have different results. So I want your opinion about that. And number 2, what's the idea of what's the contribution that EU or United States is going to give to Iraq other than increasing the division between the Iraqis? Iraqis, in the beginning of your talk, you say that Iraq under the Ottoman Empire were 3 states, or wilayat, you say. And they have a quarrel with the central government. and that it is not exactly right.
No, that's not quite what I was saying. What I was saying was, sorry to interrupt, it was just, what I meant, what I was trying to say was that those three wilayat had imposed upon them by the British the form of the nation state, so the mandate system and so on. And so that the juxtaposition of that pre-existing reality with this new institutional infrastructure set up a tension between the new centres and the former centres.
This is not exactly right. I think we need to look at it again and make sure that what you're saying is right, because this is Iraq during that time, from the time the Ottoman Empire until it became a new state, there was no quarrel between people, never. Okay, there is Sunni, Shia, Kurd, but Iraqis were always united between them as individuals. Now, with the invasion, that's the split grew up very strongly. And the political organization that has formed after the invasion, that created you stress so many times between Sunni and Shia, and it gave the idea and the opinion to anyone that there is a very deep division between the Iraqis, and that need to be studied again.
I think, if I could just quickly answer that. First of all, what I was referring to in terms of the tensions between the centre and the minorities or peripheries is the attempt primarily the attempt by the British and British-supported monarchy to repress rebellions from whether it's the north or the south, or whether it's Assyrians or Kurds or Shia and so on. So I wasn't referring to conflict between these groups, but between the new British-sponsored government and those groups. In terms of the validity of the survey, you're right. I mean, survey data is, especially in the context of the Middle East between 2010 and 2015-16, and in the case of Iraq, ongoing. Survey data is always inevitably time-bound. You know, so you're always only going to get a snapshot of the way things were at a certain point in time. And I think that the impact of that is particularly on, let's say, time-bound questions. But if you ask people about their needs, right? For example, you know, do I have enough money to feed my family? Then those needs are relatively independent from whatever the particular political need, the sort of political trend of the day might be, and so on. And I think that I think it's at that level. When I was closing and saying I think that there are possibilities, opportunities that gets overlooked by the kind of sectarianized version of the debate about Iraqi politics, I think it's at this level that we can see those opportunities. You know, if people are having the kinds of difficulties that we see through this survey, but you know, it's not just this survey, there are all sorts of other data that show this. Then, in a sense, what I'm trying to suggest is that although normally, if you look at the media, especially the Western media, if you hear Western policymakers speak, very often they take identities like Kurd, Sunni, Shia, right, as given. Right? It's inevitable that you have an identity of a certain group of people that think of themselves in a certain way. I think what I'm trying to suggest is that this data indicates otherwise. It says, or it may say, that there is a possibility for people to come together around shared needs and shared interests. For example, anti-corruption, for example, basic needs. Okay? So I would I think I agree with you when you say that the notion that there is these kind of fixed identities and we have to read Middle Eastern politics, or in the case of Iraqi politics, through the lens of these fixed identities. I think that's nonsense. Right? Of course these identities are there, they're undeniable, but to say that they then determine politics, I think is not correct. So I would agree with you with that.
It's the political system that they created after the invasion that
exactly.
It created this problem.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the political. I mean, all the parties in Iraq, they are corrupted. Exclusively, no one is not corrupt.
And you see this,
and that was created by EU and United States. And they need to know that you created that problem in Iraq. You need to help Iraq economically in order to push the people into united again.
I completely agree. I mean, for example, if I may just, and then we can move on, but if I may just say this, I think that the way in which reconstruction and transition were, so to speak, reconstruction and transition were done in the aftermath of the invasion of 2003, specifically the period 2003-2005, I'm thinking about the Coalition Provisional Authority and specifically Bremer. Measures like de-Baathification, whether we like it or not, measures like the cut of taxation revenues for the state, those production sharing agreements for oil, all of those issues essentially undermine the ability of any centralized authority to deliver on those needs that Iraqis clearly have. So what you're doing is, in a sense, you're setting up a central authority to fail. I agree with you, and the data bears it out. People think that politicians are corrupt and they want to have quite little to do with them. But I also think that that central authority is set up to fail.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
That's exactly right.
So thank you very much for your comments.
Thank you very much, Andrea. I think we'll leave some of these questions until later because thank you very much for all these. If you can leave it, keep the question, and then because we need to go for the next presenters. But I would like to thank Andrea. It's very, the least I can say, it's informative and very valuable because very rarely actually you can listen to the views of Iraqis. Everyone comes in and say, I'm a political leader. I know what the Iraqis people want. But this is the first time, on a very scientific and objective way, we understand, what they want. So thank you very much, and we'll leave. There's more opportunity for questions. Now I would like to introduce Dr. Lucia Sorbera. Lucia is a senior lecturer in the Department of Arabic Language and Cultures at the University of Sydney. Her research focuses on the contemporary political and cultural history of North Africa and the Middle East, with a specific focus on women and gender. Lucia has published on Arab women's autobiography, Arab women's political leadership, and the politics of contemporary Iraqi cinema. So, Lucia, with your field of research, mainly, as we've seen here, more on Iraqi culture and civil society, how do you see, from this perspective, Iraqis are responding to the issues that Andrea has raised?
Thank you, Firas. Thank you first for having me here, and for being here, of course, for coming here to you. I have to say that for me it's always a big pleasure to talk at Iraqi-related events, because if I decided to do Arabic studies, to study Arabic language and Middle Eastern history, it's because in 1991 I was part of the student movement against the war in Iraq. And in the context of this movement, I realized that our knowledge and the information that we received about this war and about the context in which this war was happening were absolutely incorrect, if not based. And the only way out was to study Arabic language, to have direct access to Arabic language sources, but even most important, to talk to people, to travel, to live there, and to transform the people that we were trying to understand through secondary sources in our own teachers. Now, when you learn the language from someone, then you enter into an attitude where you are able to learn many other things. And actually, from my perspective, which is more historical and ethnographic, I'm quite interested in these data because first I think that they underline that people in Iraq today tend to mobilize around the same issues that people mobilize around the world. And you know, Andrea was talking about security, about economic situation, about corruption, and about concerns about everyday life. I wonder if we would ask the same questions, and perhaps Andrea has an answer to this question, in other contexts, especially in the context of Europe under the politics of austerity, if the concerns would be, you know, if the percentages would vary or be similar. So I think that these data, if I'm not a quantitative person, and another reason why I studied languages was to get rid of maths from my studies. Well, that's the truth. But looking at them from another perspective, I find them quite fascinating because they give us, you know, some. You know, I was observing the Iraqi Social Forum a few months ago, which happened in Baghdad, and reading reports about the Iraqi Social Forum. And so when Andrea was talking about political mobilizations and the alleged lack of interest of young people for politics, I was thinking of, I agree when he was saying perhaps we should look at other spaces, no? Perhaps we should look at informal spaces of politics or new arena to build politics. And as a feminist historian, I would emphasize even further this argument because if you look at the percentages of women in formal institutions, the gender gap is huge, not only in Iraq but even in my home country, Italy. But I would never interpret this data as a low rate of interest of women in politics. There are structures which make these kind of institutions male-dominated because they were created, as Andrea was mentioning, under colonial rule. They were, you know, the product of a colonial project. And the colonial elites were male colonial elites. You know, I studied Egypt mainly, and you know, Lord Cromer, who was, you know, the governor of Egypt under colonial rule, and who was claiming that one of the reasons for Egypt to be so backward was the women's situation. Well, this man was part of the League Against Women's Suffrage in England. So, you know, this double standards by colonial elite has always been part of the political discourse, and Iraq even was in this context. So we can't expect that political institutions created under a male-dominated order will suddenly become women's friendly. Perhaps we need to change them and we need to transform them. And I find quite fascinating how women in Iraq today, but since the beginning of the anti-colonial fight, have tried to reshape politics and to rethink politics in other terms. And I think we should look at security as one of the key words to reinvent and to reshape. Our governments think of security mainly in terms of securitization or militarization of the public space. We have seen this happening in Iraq, we have seen this happening in Egypt, we have seen this happening in, we can dance perhaps, in Europe, we can have seen this happening in Europe in key particular moments. Let's talk about the issue of migration, or how the flows of people is organized in Europe is completely militarized. Well, the way feminist activists in Iraq today think of security is another way. They think of security as reappropriation by women of the public space after a long period where the occupation created a situation where streets were not safe anymore for women. In 2006-2007, at the peak of violence, I was working with Iraqi women in Italy, and you know, they were telling me how the situation was getting worse and worse under the occupation, and they were completely refusing the idea of the liberation, the rhetoric of the liberation, because for them it was not a liberation, it was absolutely a violent occupation, one of the most violent in history. Today, feminist scholars of Iraq are critical also of this vision. They emphasize that, yes, occupation was a major problem, but after 10 years we also need to look at the responsibilities of the local governments and the local elites in adopting a certain discourse about security. And again, I think that including women in this discourse would be important. Why it's so difficult to include women in this discourse, but at the same time so important? Because women choose different areas to make politics. And here I think that the field of cultural productions should be looked more deeply and with more attention. We should look at the work that Iraqi women journalists and bloggers are doing to denounce corruption, to denounce violence, to denounce the crisis in the economy, and we have many sources to do that. We should look at filmmakers, and we should look at the transnational networks between Iraqi people based in Iraq and the diasporas. New generations of, I refer in particular to the new generations of diasporic people who are very, you know, in and out from the country, but also the transgenerational links among diasporas. I conclude with the words, because I'm really keen to listen to Ben, who I only met on paper in one of his book chapters on trade unions, which was the book that actually Andrea co-edited with other two colleagues. So I would like to conclude with the words of one of my favorite Iraqi writer, Haifa Zangana, who commenting on what was happening at the end of 2007, wrote, "What the occupiers have failed to see is that Iraqis who have committed acts of resistance are not terrorists. We are people willing to risk our life, history, culture, identity, and resources. We do not hate Americans, so we do love their government's greed and brutality, and are willing to defend ourselves against it. We simply believe that Iraq belongs to Iraqi. I'm often asked the question, will you ever go back to Iraq? It always shocks me, because deep down, I never left." And I think that these words stay with most of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lucia, for highlighting the role of women. And you're right, I mean, women are half of the society, and obviously they're very much disfranchised in society now, and they probably would have changed the results even of Andrea's work. And I also mentioned that I think it was the first Arab woman minister, isn't it? Naziha Gulaimi, she was, Iraqi minister in the 1960s, so it's 59 or 60, something like that. So we have a long history of active women. Thank you, Lucia. It's my pleasure now to introduce Dr. Benjamin Isakan. And Ben, he's Associate Professor of Politics and Policy Studies and Director of Middle East Studies Forum in the Alfred Deakin Institute at Deakin University, Australia. So Ben is also an associate of the Sydney Democracy Network at the University of Sydney, and he is the author of Democracy in Iraq, History, Politics, Discourse, and the editor of 6 books, including most recently The Legacy of Iraq, from 2003 war to the Islamic State. And his current research includes a project funded by the Australian Department of Defense entitled Measuring Cultural Property Destruction in Iraq and Syria. So Ben, with this amazing CV of research and works about Iraq, I'm sure you will provide us with an in-depth perspective about where Iraq is now and what are the challenges for the future.
I think with the music playing in the background, it just seems wrong to sit down. I don't know, it feels like we should all be dancing and standing up and doing things. So perhaps after this we'll go downstairs and dance at the wedding. I noticed when I came in that every table had a bottle of Chivas Regal in there, so I reckon we could probably steal 1 or 2 of those bottles and make good of them ourselves. Thank you and good evening to you all. It is, firstly, thank you to the organisers of this event. Thank you to my esteemed colleagues here who have already given us some wonderful insights, both in terms of very good and very rare data from on the ground in Iraq, and more broader, if you like, conceptual qualitative insights into, of course, what is and remains a very burning question about the role of Iraqi women historically and up until today. There just isn't enough time to say everything that I'd like to say, so some of this is going to come out brief. These are just bits and pieces and notes that I've put together while my colleagues have been speaking, and a couple of bits and pieces that I might be able to draw on from earlier things that I've written. What I wanted to do, what I thought would be a good exercise for us, is actually to kind of play a little bit of a game. And that game might be that we imagine, and it would be a wonderful thing, we imagine that we wake up tomorrow and ISIS is gone from Iraq, right? We imagine this scenario. It's a wonderful Saturday morning, we wake up here in sunny Melbourne, and we hear on the news, it has all been done, the Iraqi security forces, the popular mobilisation units, the Peshmerga, and the international coalition overnight somehow magically got rid of ISIS, and it's completely gone from the world of Iraq. Of course, we know that's not going to happen. It's going to be a long and bloody fight, and as ISIS are pushed back, I suspect that they will get more aggressive. We've seen them in recent weeks, terrible bombings, for example, in Babel, in Baghdad, overnight being accused of using chlorine gas, chemical weapons in an attack. So as they get pushed back, they're only going to get more aggressive. But instead of focusing on how bad they are and everything that they are going to do and all the terrible things that they've done, let's pretend that they've gone. Let's pretend we wake up tomorrow and they're gone. The unfortunate truth is that if they were gone tomorrow, Iraq remains to face a series of deep systemic problems that are well beyond anything that ISIS is doing, and that are in many ways going to last longer into the future than ISIS, and are going to continue to plague the nations in all kinds of complicated ways that we have not yet even imagined the extent of these problems and the ways in which they are going to cause a great deal of distress for the Iraqi people into the future. And that is the unfortunate reality. That even if we could get rid of ISIS, somehow magically click our fingers, dance to the beat of the music downstairs, wake up tomorrow and see that ISIS are gone, we would still have this long list of problems that we have to deal with. So I'm going to dish out to you very quickly 11 problems. And there is just not enough time to do each of these problems justice, but I want to talk about them very briefly, and then if you have questions and things that you would like if you would like me to focus more on one of them or a couple of them and drill down and articulate what I mean in more detail, I'm happy to do that. So let's go through our list of 11 big problems. The first one, and I think it's a huge one, is the role of the Shia militias. These, in many cases, are acting completely autonomous of Baghdad. They are staging mass humanitarian tragedies. In January of 2015, 72 innocent Sunni Arab civilians were killed in a single day after a Shia militia had taken a village back from ISIS. So this is a really big threat. And what is an even bigger threat is that they are extremely popular. Another quantitative analysis that was done last year, at the end of December 2015, said that the most popular political movement in Iraq today is not Dawa, is not the State of Law Coalition, is not Hakim and the ISKI, is not the Kurdistan Democratic Party, the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan. It's none of these. The most popular is Bada, the Bada organisation, and Amiri. He's the most popular guy in Iraq at the moment. And we know that they ran sectarian death squads after the 2003 war, that they are responsible for some very serious humanitarian crimes. But more to the point, and I think what is a really big problem about them, is that they are controlled by Tehran, not by Baghdad. That they take their orders directly from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and the Quds forces, and they are extremely active in creating and spreading the Islamic Revolution and the Shia Islamic Revolution of Iranian theology and ideology throughout Iraq. And that is going to pose, has already posed since 2003, but is going to pose a continuous and very serious problem from the Abadi government. He has done a lot to try to temper them and to try to bring them into the Iraqi security forces, but they have achieved such a momentum now that they are going to be very difficult to stop. And actually, I think what you'll see is Amiri and Bada probably run in the next election, and because of their popularity, will most likely secure a large number of seats and able to form a coalition government and increase their stakehold in the Iraqi parliament. And that is going to be a very troubling scenario for the future of Iraq. So that's number one.
Can I interrupt?
Yes.
You're talking about democracy. You're talking about democracy.
Better leave the question to the end.
Yeah, I think let's leave the questions to
yeah, sure, whatever you like.
Let's finish the 11 points and then we'll ask questions.
I'll try to go
otherwise we will distract.
Okay, the second one is the very real threat, very increasing threat of Kurdish secession, right? After the movement of ISIS, what we saw was the Kurds kind of use a cynical opportunism. They moved into Kirkuk, which is an area that they've long coveted as the capital of a future Kurdistan. They conquered a large swathe of what's called the disputed territories. They are now in control of massive amounts of the country. And this is going to be a very difficult battle between Erbil and Baghdad to work out, after ISIS, where do we redraw the lines between the Kurdish expansion and the traditional claim to these disputed territories through Baghdad. It's an extremely complicated scenario, one I can't solve for you. What has been interesting is Amnesty International have also accused the Kurdish Peshmerga of doing war crimes, burning down various Sunni villages after conquering parts of these territories, and this also speaks volumes about their ambition to create and enlarge the Kurdish territories there. And I think that that is going to be a very complicated situation beyond ISIS. Of course, the third one is then kind of the broader Sunni marginalisation. And we talked briefly about de-Baathification. That obviously has a strong legacy. It didn't happen. De-Baathification began in 2003, but it was critical, for example, to the 2010 elections in Iraq. It was critical to the 2013 provincial elections. It was critical to the 2014 elections. De-Baathification is an ongoing proxy. It's a way of getting rid of Sunni Arab politicians, and it's a way of undermining them and delegitimising them in the political process. And more to the point, the Sunni Arabs, rightly or wrongly, have felt that they have been widely disenfranchised by the entire political process that has gone on after 2003. No matter what happens with ISIS and however you move forward, it is going to be an extremely complicated scenario to bring them back into the political fold, for them to believe that they have a stake in the political machinations that go on in Baghdad. I think that's going to be very difficult. Fourthly, we talked a little bit about corruption. Corruption is like sectarianism. It's like a lot of political phenomena. Once it digs its talons deep into the flesh of a state, it is almost impossible to rip it out. How do you get rid of corruption in a state where everyone is corrupt, where the entire bureaucratic machinery is built upon corruption? It is an extremely difficult thing. Iraq is not the only corrupt state. But it ranks in extremely low. Corruption International most recently ranked at 171 out of 177 states that it assessed in terms of corruption. And we are not talking about pennies. We are talking about billions of dollars that have been siphoned out of the Iraqi economy since 2003, and it is going to be virtually impossible to reclaim those funds, to bring those people to justice, to hold various people accountable, including those who held government under the most recent government of Nouri al-Maliki, many of whom are responsible for massive corruption. And how you deal with that in a state that is struggling with destitution and poverty and a war against the Islamic State, not to mention the falling oil prices, I think is an enormous problem on the horizon of Iraq, and that's something that has to be dealt with after ISIS. I mentioned there, now I'm up to number 5, so we're getting through them. I mentioned there the oil prices. Iraq is, for all intents and purposes, a one-item economy. It is built on oil. As oil prices have plummeted globally, this is going to have a dramatic... If you thought it was bad when oil was selling at $95 a barrel, the Iraqi economy, how is it going to be? How is it going to develop? How is it going to move forward when oil is trading at roughly $30, $40 a barrel? That's a ridiculous drop in income, and this is a massive problem for the entire Arabian Gulf. I was in Oman last year, for example, and in Oman, state salaries, the entire state salaries, were roughly $70 per barrel. So when oil was trading at $90 per barrel, you had a kind of $20 per barrel profit. Now they're trading at $30 a barrel. The entire state bureaucracy is therefore going to struggle, and the entire state may well collapse because it simply does not have the revenue to pay its own people to keep it in power. And a similar scenario is likely to unfold in Iraq because a massive percentage of people work for the state, and if the state doesn't have the ability to pay the salaries, and this has been a problem, and Abadi has been trying to deal with this, but that has been a very unpopular thing. People have been protesting en masse about his recent austerity measures. So we have a big problem in terms of the economy and the oil situation and the collapse of oil prices. Number 6, more important, this also was touched on today, and I think it's really an important existential thing. This is that Iraq is now and has always been a complex cultural mosaic. It is a beautiful tapestry that is brought together by people of all creeds and all religions and all languages and ethnic groups. And that cultural mosaic has not been completely destroyed. And the people in this room are evidence of that, of course. But it has been significantly eroded. Not just under the Ba'ath, not just since 2003, and not just since ISIS, but it has been a systemic and ongoing program in which Iraq's complexity and the beautiful arrangement of different religious and ethnic people have been affected to such an extent that it is significantly eroding the very fabric of what made Iraqi people feel Iraqi. And that was that we were all in this together, and that despite all of our differences, there was something that could hold us together. As that erodes, it is going to be very difficult to put a mosaic together, back together, right? It's an extremely complicated problem. That's number 6. Number 7, there was an article very recently published in our Monitor, and it's a very interesting article because what it talks about is, and this is a problem right across the Middle East, particularly in post-Arab Spring countries, there is a deep nostalgia for authoritarianism. And we are seeing this problem, and not everyone's going, yeah, sorry. Sorry?
Repeat the title of the set of
nostalgia for authoritarianism. In other words, it was better under Saddam, right? This narrative is emerging in Iraq in all kinds of surprising quarters. And it is not just a problem in Iraq, it's also a problem in Libya, it's also a problem in Egypt, it's also a problem so on and so on and so on, increasingly in Syria. And what the biggest problem about that is that it's not only looking back with rose-coloured glasses to a dictatorial regime, but it also gives credence to things like the ruling elite in Saudi Arabia and other Arab dictatorships who are able to say to their citizens, stay with us, back us, don't protest against us, because it's much better to live in a dictatorship that's benign, like Saudi Arabia, for example, a sort of religious dictatorship, than it is to live in Syria, or than it is to live in Iraq, where there's this mass violence that has been unleashed by toppling dictators. And this is, I think, a really big problem, not just for Iraq, but for the region. How do you deal with the balance between a nostalgia for authoritarianism and the hope of a democratic, inclusive future? Right? This is a big tension, I think, that's emerging. What am I up to? Number 8. This nostalgia for dictatorship also coincides with what I would call a malaise for democracy, a malaise with democracy. That means a deep dissatisfaction with democracy. There is a deep dissatisfaction in Iraq, understandably so, that every one of the promises about what democracy would bring to Iraq after 2003 have failed. So why would I believe in the democratic system? Why would I believe that democracy can bring good governance? It's completely failed in every sense. There is nothing that has been positive, if you like. I mean, I'm speaking in very broad generalist terms. There may be some minor positive, like there's a bit more freedom of press. There's a little bit more, like it's been great the way Abadi has not cracked down on these protesters in ways that Maliki would have done, and certainly Saddam would have done. So there is some democratic openings, but nonetheless it hasn't delivered. It hasn't delivered a better life, it hasn't delivered a safer life, it hasn't delivered a more robust economy. So why would you believe in democracy? What's the belief? Why would you believe that this is going to ever get better if after more than a decade of having all of these promises made and having all these ideas about what democracy can do, and every one of those promises have failed to deliver? Why would you believe it? Doesn't make any sense. So, understandably, there's a deep cynicism about democracy. Number 9, I'm concerned about civil society, and this was brought up in terms of women and so on, but I think it's of course, women are an extremely important part of civil society, but civil society stretches across all different aspects of Iraqi society. But there has really been a program since the arrival of the Ba'ath Party, but perhaps we could find deeper roots for it even before that, of a complete erosion of civil society. And the problem with civil society is that the very principle of it is to serve as the arbiter, the middleman between the government or the state and the people. And when you don't have a middleman, who holds the government to account? Who stands up to them and says, no, we do not agree that you will do this. No, we do not want you to do this. No, we do not believe in these things. If you erode civil society, you only increase the capacity of the state to act with more or less impunity. And this has been what Saddam did. It's been to some extent what the governments that followed the 2003 intervention did. And it's very interesting when you look at things like Paul Bremer saying, you know, we need a civil society in Iraq because it will hold the government to account, and then doing more or less everything in his power to undermine any legitimate grassroots movement that emerged in Iraq towards civil society. And that speaks nothing of what ISIS have done to civil society groups in places like Mosul and elsewhere. And without a civil society, without an active arbiter between the state and the people, the state itself is therefore, there is nothing to keep into account its raw power. That means what we may well see, the combination of all these things, the democratic malaise, the nostalgia for authoritarianism and the lack of a civil society, is that you may well see an increasingly authoritarian, or what's called pluralised authoritarianism. In other words, a democracy by name, but an authoritarian government by nature. And we came very close to that, in my view. Some of you may not share this view, under Maliki, and it will be very interesting to see whether or not we return to that under future Prime Ministers of Iraq. 10. This may surprise you as a major concern for me, but I am deeply concerned about this issue in terms of what's going to happen next in Iraq. It's the US elections. I am extremely concerned about the rhetoric of people like Donald Trump and his kind of approach to how he would deal with ISIS. If you look at some of the things that he has been saying, one of his most recent statements, he was live on Fox TV saying, I will, when you take out terrorists, you have to take out the women and children, the families. Now, to be clear, that is a direct quote from a potential future President of the United States of America advocating war crimes. Genocide is the hallmark, killing innocent women and children is the hallmark of ISIS. It ought not to be the hallmark of a future democratically elected President of the United States. But that seems to be his line, and it seems to be, and he's not alone. If you look at the rhetoric coming out of all the Republican candidates, they are all saying this. And as we know, he's remarkably popular. There is a massive momentum behind him. And what's most problematic about that is that any killing of innocent civilians, particularly Sunni innocent civilians in Iraq, will only add fuel to ISIS and their global propaganda fire. It will only increase their ability to recruit because the death of innocent civilians precisely plays into the narrative that it's all a conspiracy against the Sunni Arabs and has been since 2003. And I could talk much more about the US election and its potential consequences for Iraq, but we will return to that in a moment. I'm just thinking about whether or not... I think the final thing is the mass humanitarian tragedy. Of course, we can talk about the Christians and their treatment, particularly after the rise of ISIS, which has been terrible. We can talk also about the Yazidis and the mass persecution, the horrific, unimaginable persecution that has gone on under ISIS. But what is also a big long-term problem for Iraq is not just that those humanitarian crises have occurred, but that as a consequence of them, so many people have left. And Iraq really, since the 1990s, has suffered such a massive brain drain, what we call a brain drain. That is that those with the capacity to govern, engineers, doctors, lawyers, experienced bureaucrats, have by and large left. And that will create, and has created, a deep problem for Iraq into the future. Because how does one build a new future after ISIS if you don't have those with the necessary skills and experience and know-how in order to build the state and in order to move the country forward? So they're my kind of 11 points about what I think are some of the biggest challenges, at least, facing Iraq after ISIS. If we can imagine that we wake up tomorrow and there is no ISIS, there's still so much work that needs to be done. So thank you.
Thank you, Ben. I think you put your finger on the pulse, and you might not be very popular after that, but I think the issues you raised are really, really very big threats to Iraq, and this is the reality. Look, we've been here for almost a little bit less than 2 hours, so I think we will open up for Q&A. I'll open up, we'll give opportunity for those who did not ask questions, and please make the comment short, if you don't mind, and I'll probably take 4 questions, so. No speeches, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Shosh Ahmed, and I'm from Kurdish Voice Program on radio station. Just very brief, I'm starting with my notes. The first one for Iraqi Forum. There's a note and question. Just very quick and very brief.
Quickly, short comments and questions.
Yeah, the very short comment for Iraqi Forum organization, it should be Kurdistan flag beside Iraqi flag, because they know Iraq has been changed to federal. There's a 2 state, Iraqi, the central state and Kurdistan region state. That's my first note. And the second thing, I think for the first presenter, is the project. I think any project or presentation when talk about Iraq has to be mentioned like a Kurd and Central, because most talks about the Sunni and Shia. It doesn't mention about the Kurd, because there's a 2 nation, totally different from the idea, from culture, and I think everything. You should talk about the Kurd as well. What the idea about the Central, what the politics, and always, as well as for the second presenter, because very quick, it doesn't let me to talk too much. For the second presenter, when it's talking about the women, I think when talking about the Iraqi women, another issue is a very different with the Kurdish women and the South. Because the Kurdish women, we have a Peshmerga, they participate with the battle of against ISIS, and you see all the west of Kurdistan in Syria, you see in the Quran. And a very quick note for the third one, the third presenter, I totally agree with all the things you mentioned, but just the one note. Kirkuk is a part of Kurdistan historically, and it took back thousands. Peshmerga and Kurd people, they took our land, no control. And we know that after ISIS, maybe another issue comes, but we are ready for that. And for your wish, you say Saturday and Sunday, you wish wake up, no ISIS. I'm telling you from now, the people who create the ISIS, they now start creating another terrorist group. Thank you very much.
Should we take all the questions and then answer?
Yeah, I think that's better. Yeah.
Thank you to all the speakers. My question is, there's no denying Iraq had one of the most powerful and professional military and police forces in the 70s and 80s in the Middle East. Why did the US coalition facilitate the systematic demolition of the Iraqi police and military institutions? And why did the Iraqis allow this to happen? Is this to blame for ISIS?
I think we'll ask, because the other one was really comment, so let's answer this one. Who would like? Huh? Let's go with that. Yeah, we'll take all of them and then we'll.
Thank you for giving us this, I call it as a good lecture. Mukhlis Yusuf from the Australian Chaldean Federation. I have actually 2 questions, one for the surveying and the other one is for Mr. Ben, just regarding the issues in Iraq, especially with the survey, are excluded. You've excluded the whole indigenous people of Iraq from that survey, especially the Chaldean, the Assyrian, the Syriac. We haven't heard anything for them. This is one thing we haven't heard. What's their opinion about Iraq, the future, and especially the most Iraqi. If you ask any Iraqi at the moment, what's the kernels of civilization in Iraq? You know, they say that this is our kernel civilizations is from the Sumerian to Babylonian to Assyrian. So this is the way of culture and heritage. That's one thing. But now, Mr. Ben, just we tell you, like, you know, you put your fingers on the wind, because this is what happened in Iraq currently, and we are facing a big dilemma about the issues. How we can rectify it, what's the evaluation, where we can come up with some solution. This is very important issues. Thank you very much.
I would encourage some questions by women if there's any. No?
Last question.
Thank you for the speaker. The first question is to, I'm Dr. Al-Zaini, actually. First question to Andre. Yes, I respect you very well, but I didn't understand what's the aim of the survey and what is the result actually, and why the EU asked someone to do for Iraq on the Middle East. What is the purpose for that? This is the question I didn't understand. For the third presenter, I appreciate all what you said, and it is very encouraging us, but you didn't mention the most important point. You mentioned 11 challenges to Iraqis. This challenge is not for only Iraqis, this for all Arab countries. All right? And if you ask any Arab countries, what is the first thing you wish your country to be released from it, they will say to you, or to say to anyone, actually not to you, let US and the other countries leave their hands from us, and we will live as beautiful as European people. All right? This is the first challenges. We thank you very much that you hope that ISIS will going to be released, might be tomorrow or not tomorrow. This is who created ISIS, who created problems to Iraq, who created Saddam to Iraq, who created previous people to Iraq. Why the Iraqi people like this? Why the Syrian like this? Syria is beside Iraq. It was a very strong country. Yemen was a strong, very good country. These questions, please let me talk. The question is, and I'm just telling, the question is, he didn't put his point to the main reason to the Iraqi population and why the Iraqis didn't progress. And I think this problem will continue and continue as there's other people going to intervene with the Iraqis. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Thank you very much.
There's a few more.
Just one more, please. One more.
Yeah, to Andrea. Those slides, are they available online so that you can download them? This is Ahmed Mata. Are they available online to download them? Sure. And what's the website?
Anymore?
No, thank you, because it's getting too late, and
we need to discuss a point.
This is a very complex issue. Sorry, this is a very complex issue, and we will stay here all night, and we will not resolve all the issues we are talking about.
In order to discuss issues about Iraq. And now this is a very important issue that Benjamin...
do you have a question?
Benjamin mentioned quite a few things that first of all, I want to know what are his sources, that all the information that he have given us. Because I believe that his sources is misled. Misled because of the power of money that Saudi and Qatari has spent. That's number one. Number two is because of the United States came to Iraq in order to destroy the fabric of Iraq. And that has done to Iraq so much harm to the extent that division you see between the Iraqis. To the extent now, our friend there, you say there are two states. And it's true, it is two states now. Okay? No, we have to tell the the reality now we talk about Badr and militias, Shia militias, which as they are criminals, they have killed and committed so many crimes. These militias that you call, without them, Iraq would not have been Iraq. It would have been completely overcome by the ISIS, which America and the Gulf state planned and made. So, and you say that they, if there is election, Badr will win, and this militia will win. This will win in the western of Iraq, in the Sunni area, and will win in the Shia Iraq. The reason why? Because there is, if you believe in democracy, as you say, and as you are specialized in democracy, democracy says the majority rule. And if the majority of the Iraqis accepted them, we have to accept it. Now, you talk about the mosaic of Iraq. Yes, in Australia here we have 72 or more than 72 or 173 or 72 nations, and we live happily in harmony. Reason why? Because there is equality. Equality, not totally, but there is equality. And there is, you can say whatever you want to say, you can do whatever you want to do. Now what we need a government that is really represent the people of Iraq in order to maintain that mosaic that you are talking about. And Australia would be an example for that.
One more point, please.
Yeah. We talked about genocide. If Trump come to be a president of the United States, there will be a genocide. Is it new to America? Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Vietnam, Iraq, for the international boycott to Iraq, that destroyed the fabric of Iraq, that destroyed everything in Iraq. So it's nothing new for them.
Thank you very much. Now I'll give opportunity, very short answers from the our panel, please. You know, we don't have to go into great depths because we're really running out of time. So I think we'll start with Ben. Would like to address some of the issues that were raised. Yeah.
Shall I stand up again?
What did you think that would go on there?
No, just one good question. Just one comment. I think.
Yes, sir.
Just one comment. If America did not invade Iraq in 2003, ISIS wouldn't be existed by now.
You're absolutely right. Yeah. I've just written a book called The Legacy of Iraq. The Legacy of Iraq from the 2003 war to the Islamic State. And the point of the book is, we wouldn't be here if it wasn't for 2003. Of course, one cannot play that game with history, right? You cannot ever go back and go, well, if this didn't happen, then that wouldn't have happened. And, you know, we don't know. Maybe it would have been worse. We don't know. But what we do know is that there was, despite claims by the Bush administration, that there were chemical weapons and links to Al-Qaeda in Iraq in 2003, there were neither. And so in other words, there was no Al-Qaeda presence in Iraq prior to 2003, and here we are 13 years later with 1/3 of the country roughly controlled by a group that is worse than ISIS. So bad, you know you're bad when Al-Qaeda disowns you, you know. You have to be pretty extreme for Al-Qaeda to say ISIS is far too far down the road for us. So yes, absolutely, I agree with that principle. I don't think I don't think any credible assessment could make another conclusion. ISIS is a direct product. Al-Qaeda in Iraq, Abu al-Zarqawi's group, who are the direct forefathers of ISIS, were created by the 2003 intervention. There's no other way to make those two things. The thing that I want to say before you raise the final question is this. This debate and this inclusive, peaceful, tolerant discussion amongst Iraqi people is the solution. Someone said to me, what is the solution? Where is the answer to all of our problems? This, what is happening right now in this room, is the solution not just for the Iraqi community here in Australia, which lives in relative peace, of course, but the Iraqi people full stop. This culture of big questions, big ideas, aggressive assertions, tolerant, peaceful listening to one another even when we don't agree is exactly the thing that we as a community here in Australia, the Iraqi community here in Australia, but more to the point, you as the diaspora must feed back into your homeland, must play a role in advocating this kind of dialogue, because the only way Iraq is ever going to move forward and beyond all of those deep systemic problems that I outlined for you is if every Iraqi takes the time to acknowledge A, their own suffering, and B, the suffering of others, and C, listen to one another. Hear uncomfortable opinions, hear things that you don't agree with. Listen to the kinds of things that other groups have endured, not just under ISIS, but under the Ba'ath, under the British occupation, and in some cases for centuries. This is exactly the kind of solution that we need. So I fully applaud this event, and I also fully applaud those of you who put forward strong opinions, because I think we need to hear them. We need to learn to listen to one another, and we need to learn that it's okay to hear something that you don't agree with or that even makes your blood boil a little bit. That's the only solution. And you are right, absolutely right, to say that so many people live here in peace because they have equality before the law, but it's bigger than that. It's because we're prepared to listen to ideas that we don't like. We're prepared to see Tony Abbott come into power in an election, for example, and it may well be Malcolm Turnbull coming into power, and the day after not go out into the street and kill one another. We're prepared to understand that the change of government does not need to happen by bloodshed. We're prepared to listen to different ideas, and we're prepared to do so equally before the law. So I think that...
Likewise, we applaud you
thank
for
you.
Expressing beautifully.
Okay, thank you, yeah. Well, I think... Don't applaud me. Applaud your own initiatives to send these ideas back to Iraq, because it really is the thing. And to some extent, I applaud Abadi. I think that he, of all Iraqi leaders in the last decade or so, has done a wonderful job in trying, despite being hamstrung by a variety of different and complicated problems, not least of which are the massive protests that I don't know how he lives with on the border at the edge of the green zone. Trying his best to listen to different opinions and to inculcate this culture of listening to one another and accepting one another despite all of the differences and diversity. So rather than going and answer all of the nuanced questions that you've asked, I'm happy to talk after this if people want to come up to me and say, oh, well, you didn't really answer my question. I'm happy to answer your question, but that's my bigger point that I would like to make. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Kurdish women and are Kurdish women different from the others, and why we haven't talked about Kurdish women? Well, actually, it was not my point to underline ethnic and ethnic differences in the context of Iraq, not only for reason of spaces, but especially because from a feminist perspective, national boundaries don't play a good role for women's interests, because with all the due differences and with all the due contextual differences, the main problem for women has always been patriarchy, and patriarchy is quite transcultural. Now, it concerns Europeans, Australian, Iraqi, from whenever they come from. And also I have to say that the rhetoric of feminist organizations in Iraq, as in many other parts of the Arab world, is quite inclusive and tends to go beyond this kind of differences. Another point is that women tend to be represented either as heroes, and you were mentioning, for instance, the Peshmerga and so on, or as victims. And actually, I believe that both of these representations have some risk, bring some risk with them. In the first case, they become the symbols of the nation when they are the hero, and so something to be proud of, but at the same time, they become a property. When they are victims, they are silenced, and their agency does not appear. So I think that from the perspective of feminist scholars, it's important to try to go beyond these male-dominated representations and try to highlight the agency of women, whatever is their national or ethnic affiliations, remembering that we face multiple levels of oppression in terms of gender, of class, and nation. And with this respect, I appreciated the points that when Ben was talking about the cultural mosaic and the nostalgia of authoritarianism that we see across the region. And he underlined the longue durée of the attempt to deconstruct and to undermine this multiple cultural mosaic. I think that even here, narratives play an important role. As women, we have been told for centuries that there was always something coming before our rights. No, so now let's get rid of colonialism, and then women will be okay. It didn't happen. Let's apply socialism. Let's do the socialist revolution, and then women's problems will be solved. It didn't work like that. Let's get rid of the occupation and women will be free. No, not even that. So what I would like to say, let's try to solve women's issues and perhaps all the rest will be solved in a second moment. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. First of all, a couple of clarifications. The results that I presented emphasized the Sunni-Shia aspect, but that's just the presentation question. So all the other non-Muslim identities, Christians, Jews, and so on, are present in the data, and they are going to be made available as soon as the data for the project is made available. The question about where this is going to be made available, actually you get a preview here because we haven't officially handed in the final version to Brussels yet. But from September onwards, this stuff will be available. If anyone has any questions about specific data, specific results, I'm perfectly happy to send individual pieces of data to them, with the understanding that it's provisional, so we're still working on it. But as far as there was a question about the aims of the surveys, the results, the purposes. There's one very general purpose, which is to understand how societies change over time, right? So we're trying to put together research from a bunch of different fields, economics, sociology, political science, and so on, to try and understand how societies change over time. And specifically, what the impact of the uprisings is for these countries themselves, but then also the implications at an international level. So I hope that answers the question. But I actually wanted to go to a point which is, I think is very important, which is to take Ben's question about, even if we could get rid of Daesh/ISIS tomorrow, what would happen? And for me, what I thought he was going to do with that, and what the question is just a bias in my mind, is to ask, what would we replace that with? So what's the vision? What would be the kind of society that we could envisage, not just for the territories that are controlled by Daesh, but in general for Iraq? What's beyond the contest between specific political factions, but what's the idea? What kind of society do we want to see? And there's a really interesting question when we asked, and I didn't have time to present this, but an interesting question, we asked what people thought were the most important characteristics of democracy. And in conventional political science and in conventional public discourse and for policymakers, if you ask them what is democracy, they will say something like, well, changing governments through elections, holding free and fair elections. Yeah? But if you ask people in our surveys, and this is true more generally, not just in the Middle East, but also in Europe, to connect back to what Shia was saying, people will give you two kinds of answers. They will say, on the one hand, for sure, it's these civil and political rights, voting in order to change elites so you don't have elites that stay in power for decades, like in Italy. But the other thing that they will say is you have to have social and economic conditions, social and economic rights, social justice, that make it possible for us as individuals who have, in theory, civil and political rights, to be able to actually exercise those civil and political rights. So yes, the rights, but then also the material conditions to actually exercise those rights, to make good on them. And I think that has to be the vision thing. So when Ben was saying, well, we've had democracy in Iraq for 10 years and what has it brought? I would say we've had the label of democracy. I don't think we've had the substance of democracy. And that for me is a very important distinction, because it's a distinction that applies not just in the Iraqi context, also in the Egyptian context, the Tunisian context, the Moroccan, Jordanian, and so on, but also in Europe, right? So precisely in Europe, we have, I think, over the last 40 years, and in the West generally, we've had what I call a kind of a self-lobotomization or self-colonialization around the idea of democracy, right? Because today we tend to associate democracy with just free and fair elections in public discourse. But about 30, 40 years ago, and I remember as a child, the debate about democracy was much broader than that, right? It was about social justice. It's about economic conditions. It's about material conditions that make democracy not just a process or a letter or a word, something that's written into the constitution, but something that's actually practiced by people. And for me, that's the vision. And that's the vision not just in the context, we're talking tonight about Iraq. It's not just for Iraq, not just for the Middle East, but for the world in general, and the West specifically, right, where we seem to have forgotten some of these lessons. So this, for me, and going back to one of the questions about the purpose of this research, for me, my interest in Arab uprisings in general comes precisely from this, that they spearhead, they show what the crisis of democracy is today, right? The fact that you have these semi-authoritarian, pseudo-democratic facade democracies in the Middle East, things that look like democracies because they have elections, but aren't democracies because they're actually authoritarian, right? How do we deal with that? We can only deal with that if we have, ironically, what we could call a Marshall Plan for democracy. Remember that the Marshall Plan for the reconstruction of Europe after the Second World War had an economic function, rebuilding the economy, but it had, more importantly, a political function. That political function was trying to learn the lessons of the mistakes of World War I. In World War I, Germany was put down, was kept down, and that produced Nazis, or it helped produce Nazis. It helped produce political radicalization. To avoid the same mistake after the Second World War, the Marshall Plan specifically was designed to bring as many people on board as possible, to give people a stake, not just in the political, at the level of voting for political rights and so on, but at the substantive economic level, right? So you mainstream society, you give people something to live for, something to lose, from a cynical political point of view, yeah? That's the kind of plan that we need, I think, for the Middle East and for the West today. Because it's those economic, those material dimensions that have slowly eroded our ability to turn the letter of democracy into a lived reality. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for your patience and listening. And sorry if there were plenty of people who want to contribute, but I think we're coming to a conclusion. And I think that we agree, not to agree, but actually we agree to, I think we had a very rich discussion, deep discussion and debate, which is great. We probably did not provide all the answers, but we might even create more questions than answers, but I think the main objective of this seminar is to have insight into Iraq, and I think we achieved that. So please join me in thanking Dr. Andrea Tetti, Dr. Lucia Sorbera, and Dr. Benjamin. Thank you very much, and have a good night.